I live on a family farm that's been around for well over a century. Long before vacation homes started popping up around the nearby lakes, my family was already working this land. A few years back, a guy I barely knew ignored every "no trespassing" sign on my driveway and marched right up to my front door. Before he could finish introducing himself, he announced that he and some neighbors were planning to create a homeowners association. I laughed. He started explaining how wonderful it would be. Property values would rise, the area would look cleaner, and everyone would follow the same standards. Apparently, they needed signatures from several of the oldest properties in the area, and mine was one of them. I told him he was wasting his time. The man kept talking about rules, regulations, and community standards. That was exactly the problem. I bought this property because I didn't want someone else deciding what color my barn should be, how often I cut my grass, or what I could keep on my own land. I told him that if his HOA needed my approval to exist, they were in trouble, because there was absolutely no chance I would ever join. Instead of taking the hint, he kept pushing. Fortunately, a friend of mine who worked with the sheriff's department happened to stop by. After hearing the situation, he helped explain that no meant no. The HOA salesman finally left and was officially warned not to come back onto my property. Later, I found out several neighbors were relieved. They hadn't wanted an HOA either, but nobody had been willing to say it directly. A few weeks later, the same guy decided to host a large outdoor gathering at his lakeside property. Coincidentally, I had access to a trailer full of liquefied hog manure from a neighboring farm. Coincidentally, one of my fields sat directly upwind from his party. And coincidentally, that field happened to need fertilizing that day. Nature took care of the rest. The smell drifted exactly where the wind wanted it to go. Guests disappeared, complaints followed, and the party became memorable for all the wrong reasons. 3 months later, the man put his property on the market and moved away. The HOA idea disappeared with him. To this day, my farm remains exactly what I wanted it to be. My property, my rules, and nobody else's business. As for the field where I grow my supply of concern for HOA proposals, it's been empty for years. About a year after the HOA disaster, I figured the whole thing was finally dead and buried. Then one Saturday morning, while I was repairing a fence line, I noticed 3 unfamiliar SUVs slowly driving down the road. They stopped near my property entrance and just sat there. That immediately annoyed me. A few minutes later, 3 people stepped out carrying clipboards and cameras. One of them pointed toward my barn. Another pointed toward an old tractor that hadn't moved in 20 years. I climbed onto my ATV and drove over.
Can I help you?
The group exchanged nervous glances before the oldest one spoke. We're conducting a community improvement survey. I already knew where this was going. What community? The lakeside community. I looked around at the fields, cattle, and hundreds of acres of farmland surrounding us. This isn't a lakeside community. It's a farm. The woman with the clipboard started talking about neighborhood standards, visual consistency, and property appearance. Apparently, some of the newer residents thought the area should have a more modern image. I laughed so hard I nearly fell off the ATV. These people had moved next to active farmland and were now upset that farmland looked like farmland. One of them even suggested that old equipment should be hidden because it didn't fit the aesthetic they were trying to create. I pointed toward the rusted tractor. That tractor is older than every house around the lake combined. They didn't seem impressed. Then they asked if I'd consider attending a community meeting to discuss future improvements. I asked whether those improvements involved me spending money. They admitted that eventually they might. I asked whether those improvements involved me following rules created by people who didn't own my land. Again, they admitted yes. That was the end of the conversation. I politely informed them that the meeting could proceed without me, continue without me, and fail without me. As they left, one of them muttered that people like me were preventing progress. I responded by revving the ATV loud enough that I couldn't hear the rest. A week later, I learned their meeting had attracted fewer people than a garage sale during a thunderstorm. Apparently, most residents had no interest in paying annual fees, so someone else could tell them where to park their boat. The proposal quietly disappeared. Again, the old tractor stayed exactly where it was. The barn stayed exactly where it was. And my enthusiasm for joining neighborhood committees remained exactly where it had always been. at 0. The following spring brought a whole new batch of lake residents. You could always tell who was new. The longtime locals waved when they drove by. The newcomers drove slowly, stared at everything, and looked mildly offended that farms existed. One morning, just after sunrise, I was feeding cattle when my phone rang. The caller introduced himself as a resident from one of the lakeside cottages. He immediately launched into a complaint. Apparently, my tractor had been running too early. I looked at my watch. It was 5:17 a.m. Yes, I replied. That's when farming starts. The man explained that he had moved here for peace and quiet. I asked where he thought milk, beef, hay, and grain came from. There was a long pause. Then he informed me that several neighbors were considering filing complaints about farm noise. I thanked him for the warning and hung up. A few days later, I received an official-looking letter signed by a handful of lake residents. The letter listed several concerns: tractors, livestock, dust, machinery, the smell of manure, roosters, the fact that harvesting sometimes continued after dark. I read the entire thing twice because I genuinely thought it was a joke. These people had voluntarily moved next to working farmland and were now upset about the existence of farming. One complaint even described cattle as excessively vocal. I showed that one to my neighbor. He laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. Word spread quickly among the local farmers. Soon everyone was sharing stories about the complaint letter. One neighbor joked that we should ask the cows to keep their opinions to themselves. Another suggested issuing noise citations to the frogs in the pond. A month later, the township held a public meeting. The lakeside group showed up ready for battle. The farmers showed up ready for entertainment. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, the township supervisor finally reminded everyone of a very important fact. The farms had been here first. Most of them had existed for generations. Agricultural activities were protected under local and state regulations. In other words, if someone moved next to a farm and discovered that farms were noisy, dusty, muddy, and occasionally smelled like manure, that was their problem, not ours. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The complaint campaign vanished almost overnight. A few residents still grumbled from time to time, but most accepted reality. The tractors kept running. The cattle kept mooing. The roosters continued announcing every sunrise like they were being paid for it, and life went on exactly as it always had. Because unlike trends, committees, and neighborhood crusades, farming doesn't care about your feelings. Years passed, and eventually the drama around the lakes faded away. People came. People left. Some retired there. Some sold their cottages after discovering that country life wasn't quite the peaceful postcard they had imagined. Through it all, the farm remained. The same fields stretched across the horizon. The same barns stood against the weather. The same dirt roads carried tractors instead of luxury SUVs. One autumn evening, I was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset when I noticed something that made me laugh. The old HOA enthusiast's former property was for sale again. Third owner in less than 10 years. The sign had become almost permanent. Meanwhile, our farm had passed another generation milestone. The land was still producing crops. The buildings were still standing. And the family was still here. That was the difference. Many people viewed land as an investment. My family viewed it as a responsibility. For more than 170 years, generations before me had worked this ground through droughts, floods, economic crashes, and changing times. None of them had asked permission from a homeowners association. None of them had needed approval from a neighborhood committee. And none of them had spent their evenings arguing about the approved color of a mailbox. As the sun disappeared beyond the fields, I looked across the property and thought about all the people who had tried to tell me what should be done with my land. Every one of them was gone. The farm was still here. The old tractor was still parked behind the barn. The cattle were still grazing. The grass was still growing wherever it pleased. And not a single HOA rulebook existed anywhere on the property. The truth is simple. Land outlasts opinions. Hard work outlasts trends. And freedom is worth far more than the false promise of community standards. So if anyone ever knocks on my door again, carrying a clipboard and talking about regulations, committees, or neighborhood oversight, they'll get the same answer everyone else received. No. Now kindly leave the way you came, because this farm has survived for nearly 2 centuries without an HOA.